Good morning, everyone. It's the 15th of January, and we're here with a Bugcrowd Security Flash. We're going to be talking about where we're up to with Salt Typhoon. My name's Casey Ellis. I'm the founder of Bugcrowd, and I have with me Trey Ford. Trey, do you want
Howdy.
to introduce yourself briefly?
Hey, folks. Trey Ford. I'm the newly minted CISO of the Americas for Bugcrowd. Good to be here.
Fantastic. So yeah, let's talk about the typhoons in general, but specifically Salt Typhoon. I think you and I were jamming just before we got on about this, general sort of set of campaigns that are happening. So do you want to touch on that? What's the backstory here?
Yeah, so I like to always frame when we talk about nation state adversaries. So when we talk about typhoons, we're talking about a group of focused adversaries coming out of the People's Republic of China. Bob Lord always briefed the Yahoo board with this one mental frame. We work up against dedicated human adversaries who organize their work into campaigns. These folks, they're humans just like us. They work for bosses with specified outcomes, how they're measuring success. So Flax Typhoon, Volt Typhoon, Silk Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, these are all major focused projects or campaigns driving into US infrastructure with a variety of focused outcomes and measures of success.
Hmm.
Salt Typhoon is what we're here to talk about today.
Yeah, definitely. And it's been interesting. I think the thing that's been different with Salt Typhoon from my perspective is that everyone's talking about it. You talk about Flax Typhoon, Volt Typhoon. There's been different kind of levels of public awareness of some of these campaigns and kind of their effects over the past couple of years. But the idea of, I think it's nine major telecommunications providers in the US being compromised and everyone being told not to use SMS and all sorts of things. That's kind of a level up in terms of public impact and public awareness.
Yeah, so some of the other Typhoon projects were focused on manufacturing or government installations related to, I don't know, Taiwan or other infrastructure. It's been tied to end of life IoT devices and other types of things. This one's in your pocket. This is in your friend's pocket or purse.
Hmm.
This strikes home close to everyone, and so this became personal. Where what do you mean people can read my text messages? What do you mean people like? Salt Typhoon has targeted CALIA, the computer aided law enforcement access protocol and backend infrastructure for serving warrants, and getting very intimate information about our communications. This one's personal.
Yeah, and just tapping on that for a second. So that's the wiretap piece, right? Like this was the I think I posted a tweet saying patch your wiretaps, as I'm accustomed to do when there's big vulnerabilities or breaches going on. But the idea of wiretapping infrastructure being kind of compromised and ultimately accessible to a nation state adversary, that was definitely a level up.
Yeah, it's concerning. I think in the cybersecurity community, we always worry about backdoors in our protocols, backdoors in our technologies. This was specifically a backdoor designed to serve warrants in our infrastructure providers. And so the idea that a backdoor could be used by literally anyone or an adversary is a terrifying concept. It's
Hmm.
personal.
Yeah. All right. So I guess, and we'll come back to that a little bit when we talk about kind of what do we do next about all of this, because there are definitely some mitigation things to think through when it comes to that kind of change in the threat environment. But in terms of how this all happened, what I guess we were jamming about that, and I'll let you kind of lead it up. But what do we know about how this all kind of kicked off in the first place?
Well, I think framing this in terms of a campaign is the starting place. So everyone that's ever worked in a bounty or done penetration testing starts with the edges. Your core applications, your core infrastructure will always be the tightest, the most secure, the most heavily tested. And so what we understand about this started at smaller targets. When we talk about business, there's organic growth, you're building, you're selling, you're driving. There's inorganic growth. You're buying companies and infrastructure, folding them into your business. They're not going to be running on the same stack. They're not going to have the same monitoring. They're not going to have the same technology. And so they are, in effect, softer targets. And that's a logical place to start your campaign.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just to reiterate there, talking about some of the smaller, I guess, telco providers that were acquired by some of these larger ones on this list of nine that ultimately came out and said that they've been breached, do seem to be the initial point of intrusion and the point of, call it, lateral and vertical movement. So getting into a potentially smaller and less well guarded or less well understood, entity that might have been acquired by a larger one, and then using that as a pivot point to get up into a larger provider. That seems to be something that's happened here, not necessarily in all the intrusions, but that there does seem to be evidence of that. The other piece that's definitely come out a fair bit is that a lot of kind of edge device compromise. The actual intrusions themselves, I think the first announcement that dropped was in August of 2024. But in terms of community research that's out there, and this stuff, has been published at this point, or parts of it have been dropped as a story. Evidence of this campaign being successful and actually having access to telecommunication infrastructure, evidence of that dates back as far as 2020 at this point. So when you think about what was going on around that time, you've got obviously COVID creating a lot of chaos around the world, a lot of shifts in approaches to IT, enabling public access, putting things on the edge, putting them on the public internet that weren't necessarily designed to be on the edge in that way, or doing that hastily as an infrastructure change within an organization. There was obviously a lot of that going on through that period. If you recall as well, it was also the season of some of these major kind of remote access vulnerabilities and some of the kind of internet-wide trash fires that popped up around that season. So there does seem to be some degree of timing line up between some of the initial efforts that ultimately led to some of the things that we've heard about in the press over the past couple of months now, and some of those things that were going back as far as 2020.
Well, I think it's important to pause and reflect on how long and how patient these campaigns can be. So when you're setting up for
100%.
specific like nation level targets, they didn't just walk up and log into a Kalia. Like they had to work their way up from small targets. And so we'll talk a little bit about in a moment how we should be thinking about defensive and strategic considerations to defend against this. But a patient adversary is willing to take the time to work their way up. They're
Yeah.
going to use specific tools that have not been used anywhere else so they don't hit the radar. They're not going to meet signatures. They're going to have specific behaviors. And they're not going to be in banging around making a lot of noise. They're going to be really patient, really thorough, really thoughtful, and take their time so as not to hit the radar.
Yeah, no, definitely, and that has been a feature of this particular threat actor. A couple of others out of the Ministry for Security Services, the MSS, out of the PRC, are known for what's referred to as lol bins, or living off the land.
Yep.
So the idea of basically not necessarily using anything that's custom or anything that's going to trigger endpoint detection, those sorts of things, and actually having, they're basically like Windows sysadmins that learn how to do offensive work is kind of the funnest way to think about it, because they're literally using the tools that are already in the operating system in ways that maybe weren't intended, and in ways that exploit the available access depending on how things are configured. So that sort of stealthy behavior, it's
Yeah.
obviously more difficult to detect. It gives them a greater dwell time and more opportunity to do the things that they're there to do, but also to potentially to take advantage of opportunistic things that pop up along the way, like this wiretap infrastructure. There's definitely some debate around whether or not that was actually deliberately targeted at the outset of this campaign, or whether or not they were actually just already in there looking for access to telecommunications infrastructure, looking for adjacencies to large data reserves, all those different things, and all of a sudden found themselves on wiretapping infrastructure. It could be either way. We actually don't know that part yet, but
And PRC hasn't called and told us what they're after, huh?
yeah, I think they haven't returned requests for comment at this time. So yeah, there is that.
It's interesting. Like I'd like to arc off that when you think about, we had all these concerns about different power utilities inside, like PowerShell inside of Windows, right? Are you signing all of your scripts, all the thing? Like there's all these considerations, but when you start thinking about real-time operating systems and what we're
Mm,
seeing at the core of our carriers, similar operating systems, but very specialized. And the population of folks that interact with those much smaller. You
yep.
can't go to the local yard sale and pick up one of these machines and bang on it. There's a handful of them or a handful of companies operating them globally. It's
Yep.
almost at this point like looking at a mainframe. Like there's a handful of folks that have them in their basement. I only know two or three of those humans. Like
Yep.
it's a different population. And so living off the land, you're only battling a handful of sysadmins that fully understand what's happening on those systems.
Absolutely. And I think part of the reason why it's successful is that, the same things that cause a constraint on the amount of offensive talent that's available for these types of bits of gear, and even these kind of environments in general. The same thing applies to actually setting them up in the first place. So the
Yep.
idea that like a misconfiguration is a lot easier if you've got a weird system that people don't understand, or if you've got a system doing a weird thing. That's definitely something that's being exploited here. So, talking very briefly about the present component, yeah, just to speak to that really quickly, the thing that's come out a lot as a part of this intrusion is that the telcos have had a really hard time getting these attackers out, um, which I think a natural reaction a lot of people have to that is like, oh my gosh, like why that doesn't make sense. Like just get them out of there and return to normal business. But when you consider what a telco looks like on the inside, Bugcrowd counts a number of them as customers, and obviously we kind of work in the technology industry with telco adjacent companies all the time. Like these places are vast and they've got such a diverse technology stack that the idea of an attacker that's had the opportunity to dwell for a period of time being hard to identify and hard to fully eject, that's actually not that absurd, right?
No, not at all. When you think,
Yeah.
so we're talking about telco and major carriers, which means they have a vast number of ingress egress points, which means there's not a single
This is
choke
like
point to
the
observe.
internet.
That's right. It's the whole
Yeah.
internet. It's truly the
Yeah.
internet. The other thing to think about is, if this is a multi-staged campaign with a group of folks that are specialized in different ways, working over a period of years, which means the island hopping that they've done through the infrastructure to exact their outcomes, they're going to have
Yeah.
multiple points that are going to have to be cleansed in sequence. And I don't know how long most companies keep logs. They're not keeping 10 years of logs. They're certainly not keeping 5 years of logs hot. And so the forensics going through all those logs across all these infrastructures, never mind mergers and acquisitions where you may not have the same log hygiene and depth, you're going to become blind very, very quickly.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, just calling that out is kind of a feature of this because I think some of the alarm bell sounding that came out of CISO, FBI, others, and even the telcos themselves once they kind of joined the conversation. Really, I think was reflective of that, like this the pervasiveness of the intrusion and kind of the things that attackers have the ability to access and kind of what the security implications of that are for literally everyone else. That was a pretty severe moment. So I guess pivoting to thinking about, what does this mean for operators like today and going forward on the defensive side, but then also in terms of some of the recommendations and guidance that's been given out to consumers. Do you want to touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I guess the terrifying piece that's in everyone's pocket and purse is the place to start. Unencrypted communications are legible to carriers and platforms, and so anything that's going to be sensitive, like you need to be aware, we need to be using crypto for our communications. That's the first important thing. SMS can't be trusted, and um,
And just on that, by crypto,
yeah.
you mean like end-to-end encryption, not cryptocurrency.
Correct. Yes, thank you. Yeah. So
Yeah.
end-to-end crypto is super important. Understanding that things are not going to be legible by the carriers of the platforms.
Yep.
The next piece I think gets into two-step or multi-factor authentication. So I think the golden standard is going to be something like I don't want to recommend platforms, but FIDO type of authentication is going to be by far superior, but moving towards more advanced forms of multi-factor authentication, not based on SMS, is a critical path for anything tied to platform or sensitive access.
Yeah. Yeah. No, definitely. And on the encryption piece, the idea of I think the way that you framed it when we were talking about it earlier on was the idea that if the carrier can see it, then you need to assume that an adversary can. So this whole
Yeah.
idea of separating secret communication from private communication, and then maybe having a rethink about what you actually consider as private communication and how you kind of want to safeguard that or the kind of things that you want to put in place. It's a really good time to be doing that. And this is advice and guidance that I think has been going out into the ether for quite some time now. The idea of like SMS is better than reusing the same password everywhere and not having a second factor, but it
Only
is
incrementally so.
it
Yeah.
is unencrypted, and if there's any failure in the ability to kind of protect that transit line of that unencrypted communication, then you're basically back in the same spot, which is kind of the position that we're finding ourselves in right now. So, um,
If it's a sensitive conversation, don't send a postcard. It needs to be wrapped and protected.
yeah, there you go, there you go. So yeah, in terms of defenders, I guess the other part, probably a couple of bits that I'd add to that on the defensive side, this whole idea of attacker ejection, attacker identification, and ejection being pretty difficult for a lot of these telcos, given their size and given their pervasiveness. the idea of if you're not already thinking about it, it's not obviously they're thinking about this stuff now because they're in the middle of dealing with this intrusion, but anyone who's adjacent to this type of space, like major infrastructure, major carriers, data storage, PaaS platforms, they've all been kind of zoned in on as adjacent targets of this type of
Yeah.
activity out of Salt Typhoon in particular. And historically, the MSS has a rich history of knowing what to do with data. Like they'll go after big data stores and just hoover them up with the ability to process them, you know, locally. Um, that goes back. I remember dealing with that in like the late 90s, early 2000s back in Australia around, mining companies and different things like that. So this is a take that's actually very attractive to them. That's not necessarily intuitive to people that think about what they do in that sense. It's not your classic kind of secret leakage, data breach consideration or PII or credit card data breach consideration. It's just like it's gonna be useful to them in ways that we don't necessarily fully understand. So make sure that you're thinking about it as something that can be targeted, and that is attractive as a potential target. So I think that would be one piece, just thinking about that from a threat modeling standpoint.
Yes.
Obviously, there's
Yes.
that section that we talked about before around some of these kind of smaller carriers actually being used to pivot up into larger organizations. I mean, I think that responsibility and awareness goes in both directions. The larger ones looking after the smaller ones that don't necessarily have um, the wherewithal or the resource or whatever it might be to actually do that for themselves. And obviously, there's an acquirer responsibility that comes into play there. But then, as a smaller carrier or a smaller operator, again, thinking about yourself as potentially a step in a supply chain attack to a larger target, I think it's a really good time. Like this breach, and I think a bunch of other stuff that's been going on lately is a really good opportunity to reinforce that thinking within that group of people. We are all part of someone else's supply chain, and we need to be thinking about our threat model in that way.
Yeah, if I were to over summarize back to crayon level, if I had a nickel for every time a CEO asked me, well, why would anyone hack us? We don't have anything.
Yeah,
It's impossible to be objective for your organization about why someone would value your infrastructure, your data, or the access and relationships you have. To your point, you don't have to be a company that's providing service to nuclear weapons or to nuclear energy or to the core of finances or to any critical infrastructure. You may have a relationship. You may have a service provider relationship. You may have access. And so when you think about all the things you're associated with, the custodial duty you have to protect, to harden, to defend, to monitor your infrastructure doesn't just stop at the bounds of your organization. Those relationships really do matter.
absolutely.
Coming out of I spent a fair amount of time in private equity doing M&A diligence, and it's difficult when I think about with sympathy and empathy towards the telco carriers acquiring all these smaller carriers, regional carriers. You want to look good, you put your best foot forward, you're going to paint the picture as honestly but as best as you can. I don't know how many organizations build their infrastructure and make infrastructure decisions based upon how easy will we be to integrate post acquisition. And when we start thinking about once we've acquired an organization, we're looking at time to value. The board, the executive leadership team, they're metriced on time to value. How do we get this asset into our service? We've got to think really hard about inventorying admin accounts, power accounts, service accounts, look at those trust relationships and understanding how well do we have a handle on those things? What is our visibility? Can we mine into logs? These are difficult things to think through, but again, it's not just the bounds of your organization. It's everyone you're serving and partnered with.
Absolutely. Cool. Well, we might wrap it there because I feel like we could talk about this one forever. And I
Yeah.
think we will come back to some of these kind of call it nation state level activities and some of the shifting trends in attacker and defender behavior. Something that we've been talking about a lot. The idea that the international relations environment, like we are effectively in Cold War II when it comes to cyberspace, most definitely. So the whole idea of like what does that change in terms of defensive assumptions, threat assumptions that we're making? Um, what do we need to be doing differently? What are the things that we've done to this point that maybe won't work anymore? And what do we really need to start doing now? I think those are a set of pretty interesting conversations to have that are kind of all tied to this. But we've been going on for I think long enough at this point around Salt Typhoon, and we'll wrap it there. Really
Agree.
appreciate you jumping on, Trey. It's always fun to chat about this stuff. And yeah, look, for anyone who's out there, our involvement in this type of, defense against this type of activity, you can deploy the crowd to make your systems more resilient. You can deploy the crowd to basically, kind of almost level out the resourcing and the capability to some degree that's being applied to intrusion in things like this. If there's any way that we can help with this stuff, feel free to give us a call. We'd love to participate with that. And as I mentioned, we have been working with a bunch of these operators to actually work on this particular intrusion. I suspect we'll see more of that throughout the course of 2025. So, yeah, if you need a hand, feel free to holler. And yeah, thank you for joining us on today's Security Flash. Cheers.